The land report and the SROC showed there's a lot of changes already underway in association with some of which are attributable to climate change already. But as Pete Smith said earlier, there's other changes happening as well in the land system, which are not directly caused by climate change, but interact with it and contribute to it. So increases in food demand, for example, or changes in food demand from different sources. And we heard a talk about changes in desertification and land degradation as well. So climate is changing, but the land surface is also changing due to direct human action as well. So one of the timescales is now, and the recent past changes underway. The other timescale of interest is the next decade or so, and again, this is the remainder of that figure from the 1.5 degree report. This introduces one of the reasons for this very popular meme which came out on 12 years to save the world. It was almost one of the headlines after the 1.5 degree report. So one of the reasons was that 2030 is about the early state that we might expect to reach 1.5 degrees global warming relative to pre-industrial, given the range of uncertainty, if we follow the current rate of warming. There's another reason for this as well, which I'll talk about later. But the point here is that a lot of this change is already locked in, and we can expect to see it. This figure shows the different scenarios of stabilising global warming under net zero emissions by 2050. So that was from the 1.5 degree report. But looking beyond the next few decades out to the end of the century, this figure is actually from the Ocean and Cryosphere report, although earlier versions of it appeared in the fifth assessment report. You've seen it many times. This is the projections of global mean surface temperature under two different scenarios which are broadly considered to bound the upper and lower possibilities, or maybe not quite the lower possibilities if we can achieve even more ambitious action. But this is the RCP 2.6 scenario, so the scenario which, as Joe House said earlier, leads to warming of between about 1 and 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial. That was the original 2 degree target scenario. This one is the RCP 8.5 scenario. It's not quite business as usual, it's probably above business as usual slightly. Current policies would probably take us to global warming of between about 2.5 and 4.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So this is slightly above that, but it's certainly still plausible and possible, especially if you account for carbon cycle feedbacks on climate change. So the point here is that if you go beyond, say, about 2030, 2040, that's when you start to see the difference between emissions scenarios. Before then, they're not that much different. So these kind of changes in the next decade or so are going to happen whatever we do. But beyond that, we can make a difference, and we can make a huge difference by the end of the century by keeping CO2 concentrations and emissions and other greenhouse gases low. But going beyond that, Matt Collins showed this figure of sea level rise. So after the end of the 21st century, we're committed to some level of sea level rise, even under the low emissions scenario. This is the model-based result, which is up to about 1 metre or so, it was thought. Although I think this bar here, which I believe is based on expert elicitation, suggests the possibility of a lock-in of possibly up to 2, but I'm not sure the level of confidence in that. But under the high emissions scenario, it's anywhere between about just over 2 metres and just over 5 metres by at the end of the 2300. So long-term major impacts of sea level. So it's not just a near-term issue, we're leaving potentially huge impacts for future generations. Matt talked about this earlier, the impacts of different ice masses and ocean heat content and so on, which lead to the difference between the higher and lower scenarios. But the point is to bring this back to the nearer term timescales. If we want to be near this lower impact scenario, we do have to be cutting emissions urgently and deeply, starting pretty much now. And this is the other reason why the 12 years to save the world meme came in. Sort of by 2030, that's when we need to have reduced global CO2 emissions by about 50%, and they need to be about zero, net zero, shortly after 2050, and then negative after that. So that's where the use of the land comes in. Negative emissions will involve the use of the land for carbon sequestration or bioenergy and so on. And again, we heard earlier about different scenarios of how this may be achieved. So this is a different version of one of the figures we saw earlier. Two different socioeconomic pathways. SSP stands for shared socioeconomic pathways, so different scenarios of the future human world. The one so-called sustainability focused involves reduction in crop and pasture lands over the century and an increase in bioenergy, carbon capture and storage there, BC, an increase in forestry, and a small change in natural land. The resource intensive scenario, similar in terms of reduction in areas for food production, but also reduction in natural land, a small increase in forestry, but a larger increase in bioenergy. So different ways in which this could play out. So the urgency of mitigation, which is within the next years to decades, to avoid the longer term impacts, does necessarily imply the use of the land for mitigation. So does my sort of summary on this synthesis then is that increased need for adaptation action already exists because there are risks already increasing due to climate change, and there's growing commitments to long-term impacts such as sea level rise. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would require urgent mitigation, and net emissions will therefore need to become negative, which brings in the use of the land. But as we heard in earlier talks, there's lots of synergies and trade-offs between use of the land for mitigation and use of land for other things such as food production and wilderness and so on. So that was my brief sort of synthesis to introduce this session. We're going to run this slightly differently to the previous sessions, so we won't have a set of speakers and then a separate panel. The panel will be made up of people who will give their initial thoughts, and then we'll throw it open to discussion. So if I can invite the panel members to come up and sit at the table, please. We've got Dr. Emily Shuckburgh from University of Cambridge, Damita Adhikari from Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, so right here in this building. Dr. Stephen Cornelius from WWF UK, and Henry Dimbleby from Leon Restaurants and Sustainable Restaurant Association. And between them, they are covering the areas of science, government, NGOs and industry. So each representing a huge area in themselves. So in a minute I'll invite them to give a few minutes of introduction, and then I'll throw the questions open to the audience. Although I would suggest that we can, in the discussion, we can also include perhaps questions for earlier speakers, since a lot of the lead authors of the reports are still in the audience. So bear in mind we can have a proper group discussion, although obviously the main focus is on the panellists. So I will introduce the panellists in a bit more detail one by one, and then invite them to give their opening remarks. So Dr. Emily Shuckburgh at the far end is Director of Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge and a reader in environmental data science at the Department of Computer Science and Technology. She's a mathematician and climate scientist and a fellow of Darwin College, a fellow of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and associate fellow for the Centre for Science and Policy, and a fellow of the British Antarctic Survey. Next along is Stephen Cornelius from WWF UK. He's been WWF's Chief Advisor on Climate Change since 2015. He leads WWF's engagement with the IPCC, and he spent over a decade working on science and policy around international climate change for the British government, including the UNFCCC negotiations and the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. Damita Adhikari from BEIS is the Director of Science and Innovation for Climate and Energy, leading work on delivery of the Department's Energy Innovation Portfolio and Energy Engineering and Climate Science Advisory. He's an engineer with an industrial and academic background specialising in energy and innovation, and a fellow of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. And Henry Dimbleby, nearest to me, co-founded the Leon restaurant chain before going on to become Director of London Union, which runs some of London's most successful street food markets. He's a co-founder of the Sustainable Restaurant Association, and he co-authored the school food plan which set out actions to transform what children eat in schools and how they learn about food. So a great variety of expertise there to give you their thoughts and for you to quiz on this. We did send out a few questions for initial thoughts, which you can either address or not if you prefer not to, but I'll let you know what the questions were as a reminder. So the first question was, how does climate change affect your organisation? The second was, how will changing your practices, which could be your organisation or it could be yourself, impact on climate change? And thirdly, what are the challenges and opportunities that your organisation faces right now in the context of climate change? So perhaps if we sort of start at the far end, Emily, do you want to go first?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you very much.